As we say goodbye to 2014, we're going to press the rewind button. Well, during the next 2 hours, we'll explore the events, issues, and people that have changed our world over the past 12 months. So join us for this very special edition of Arise Review. Rewind 2014 begins right now. Hello, I'm Julian Phillips. We are honored to have with us for this first hour a man who not only witnessed history, he helped shape it. Dr. Robert Gates served as U.S. Secretary of Defense from 2006 till July of 2011 in the administrations of George W. Bush as well as Barack Obama. Now, he is the only Secretary of Defense in American history to be asked to remain in office by a newly elected president. Dr. Gates has also served as director of the CIA and advised both Democratic and Republican presidents over the decades. And along the way, he held the office of university president at Texas A&M and is currently chancellor of the College of William and Mary. His book, Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary at War, was released earlier this year and became a bestseller. Welcome to Arise Review, Dr. Gates.
Thank you. Hello.
Okay. Well, there's so much to talk about in this hour, and since you've long been an expert on the former Soviet Union and on Russia, especially Russia under Vladimir Putin, let's start with a look back at the events that unfolded in Ukraine this past year. After Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych bowed to Russian pressure to reject economic ties with the West, demonstrations broke out. Protesters wanted the 2004 constitution suspended by Yanukovych reinstated. Yanukovych was forced to flee. An interim government was set up, claiming the need to protect ethnic Russians. President Putin annexed Crimea in March. Charging the move violated the sovereignty of Ukraine, the U.S. led the charge to impose sanctions against Russia. Fighting spread to eastern Ukraine after pro-Russian militants seized government buildings. Russia denied it was behind the insurrection.
Урочисто присягаю на вірність Україні.
In June, Petro Poroshenko was sworn in as president.
The results of the election bring the firm victory of all democratic, pro-European, pro-Ukrainian forces.
The victory is coming at a high cost. Despite numerous attempts at ceasefires, almost 5,000 have died and about 1 million people have been displaced. As Putin continues to dig in his heels, the West continues to add pressure. The tightening sanctions and the fall in the price of oil are wrecking the Russian economy. But still, Crimea remains under the control of Russia. Eastern Ukraine is still being contested, and Putin's becoming increasingly pugnacious. Well, Dr. Gates, with your experience dealing with Putin through the years, are you surprised by his actions in the Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. I think Putin really has two objectives here. One is personal on his part, and one is historical. The personal one is, I think he has come to see it as a historical mission for him personally to protect the Russians that were left behind when the Soviet Union collapsed. The 25 million Russians who ended up in newly independent states, and he is determined to ensure that they have the right to use their language, to observe their Russian Orthodox faith, and frankly, to look to Russia for protection. So that's a historical mission he has taken on. I think the other mission is as old as the Russian Empire itself, and that is to reconstitute a buffer of friendly states on the periphery of Russia that look to Moscow economically, politically, and for security. And he is trying to do this. Ukraine is central to both of those missions. There are probably more Russians living in eastern Ukraine than in any of the other newly independent states after the collapse of the Soviets. So I think that his efforts in Ukraine really are the centerpiece. Just a little bit of history. The Russian Empire has its roots in Ukraine, in Kiev, over 1,000 years ago. So I think there's an emotional and historical tie there, as well as power politics.
As a fact, Mr. Gates, you'd mentioned that Putin felt that the end of the Soviet Union was the worst geopolitical event of the 20th century. So I think that sums it up, as you have in your book there, quite aptly here. Now, you wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal arguing for a long-term strategy against Russia. How can the U.S. and its allies counter Putin's influence in Eastern Europe as well as Central Asia, in your opinion?
I think it has several parts. One of the things that was pretty clear when I became Secretary of Defense was that the Russians had a pretty aggressive covert operation in a number of the Central Asian states, as an example, to foster anti-Americanism, anti-Europeanism, to try and persuade those states, the peoples of those states, that Westerners were hostile and that they should look to Russia. And so my view from the very beginning when I became Secretary was that the U.S. ought to be countering that propaganda campaign with our own efforts in those states. I think that there are other aspects to it. I think that the actions that have been taken to strengthen NATO in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and the Baltic states, are the right moves. My own view is that we probably ought to have some kind of a rotational U.S. force in Poland and the Baltic states to make it clear to Putin that any military action against those states would bring a real crisis with the United States. But I also think that we need an economic strategy. The Baltic states are heavily independent economically on Russia, and should Russia decide to turn the screws on them, they would be in real trouble. So I think that the EU, NATO, the U.S. Ought to work together to create some kind of an economic safety net for the three Baltic states. So I think it's a combination of political influence, military strength, and economic cooperation and support to give those countries the confidence that they can withstand pressures from Russia.
Sure, Dr. Gates, I want to focus right now on the economy, as a matter of fact. Here, the ruble, as you know, is crashing, and Russia's economy, by many accounts, is heading into a recession. Is this the new diplomacy by other means that some experts are stating?
I think that there was some question whether sanctions would have a real impact on Russia. I think what we've seen in recent months is that the combination of limits, particularly on the banks and on transfer of technology, for example, in the oil and gas industry and so on, have had an impact. And then it's been significantly accelerated, it seems to me, by the very significant fall in the price of oil. As I understand it, the Russian budget was constructed on the basis of about $100 to $103 per barrel oil. And with oil now at around $60, that's a huge hit. Putin seems confident that he can ride this out, that this is a year or two of hard going for Russia, and he's trying to portray it to the Russian people that they're going to have to put up with these sacrifices, that this is all a plot by the West to weaken Russia, as he puts it, to take away their claws and their teeth. And so I think he's going to play this nationalist card in terms of telling the Russians, this is why you have to sacrifice, this is why you have to do without, and we'll get through this, and it'll take a couple of years.
You know, Dr. Gates, looking at Ukraine, I've got to ask, do you think that we've written off Crimea at this point, totally?
Well, I think that the West, I think that, let me put it this way, I don't think Putin is prepared to give up Crimea at all. Crimea was part of Russia for a very long time, long before the Soviet Union was created. It has their only Navy base on the Black Sea. So I think there's virtually no chance that Putin is going to give up on Crimea. I think that the issue in question is just how aggressive he intends to be in eastern Ukraine itself. Does he want to establish a land bridge to Crimea to ensure that Russia has access by land to that area? And does he want eastern Ukraine to be autonomous? Does he want it to be an independent state, this Novorossiya that he has talked about, this new Russia, trying to put an ideological, historical underpinning that this always has been Russian territory or something like that? But I think that he is determined that eastern Ukraine will have to look to Russia and be part of that buffer that I talked about earlier. And how far he's prepared to go to ensure that, I think, remains to be seen.
Okay, Dr. Gates, stay with us here. Of course, UN traditional warfare by non-state aggressors has also rocked the world in 2014. We'll discuss that story with the former Defense Secretary next. And of course, you're watching a special edition of Arise Review. Whether you call it ISIS, ISIL, IS, or the Islamic State, the sudden rise and incredible brutality of this terror group has shocked the world and eclipsed al-Qaeda in capturing headlines.
Today I authorized 2 operations in Iraq. Targeted airstrikes to protect our American personnel and a humanitarian effort to help save thousands of Iraqi civilians who are trapped on a mountain without food and water and facing almost certain death.
U.S.-led bombing has killed some of ISIL's leaders. Along with Kurdish fighters and the Iraqi military, the bombings may have even halted ISIL's relentless march across Iraq as it seeks to establish a caliphate.
We will play our part in destroying these evil extremists. We will support our Muslim friends around the world as they reclaim their religion.
Despite beheadings, mass executions, and a state-like apparatus that rakes in about $2 million a day, ISIL is not at the top of the U.S.'s terrorist list. Little known until recently, the Syrian-based group called Khorasan may pose a more immediate international threat. In Afghanistan, as the U.S. and U.K. draw down their military forces, the Taliban is stepping up its attacks. Forced from power when coalition troops invaded in 2001, the Taliban want to return the war-scarred country to their repressive interpretation of Sharia law. And despite international assistance, the 200 schoolgirls abducted by Boko Haram are still missing. Hating Western education, the Islamic militants continue to terrorize northeastern Nigeria.
Bring back our girls.
Well, Boko Haram, the Taliban, ISIL all wave the banner of religion while committing acts of barbarism. We're back with former Defense Secretary Robert Gates. Dr. Gates, as you departed the Defense Department in 2011, the U.S. was winding down its military presence in Iraq. Now the U.S. is once again, as you know, involved with airstrikes and advisors. What happened here?
I think, first of all, it's important to realize that what we're seeing in all of these different situations, including in Nigeria and in East Africa, is an internal conflict in the Islamic world. And there are really 4 conflicts going on simultaneously. There is the conflict between Shia Islam, led by Iran, versus Sunni Islam, led by Saudi Arabia. There is the conflict between reformers and authoritarians, between secularists and Islamists, and then the struggle that you've just been referring to on whether artificially created states like Syria, Iraq, and I would say Libya can survive without repression. These are artificially constructed states with historically adversarial groups, tribes, clans, and religious groups. And right now, if we look at Libya and Syria, the question of whether they can be held together, I think, is very much an open one. In terms of ISIL itself, I think that what we saw, that ISIL has its origins and its success in 2 things. The first was the terrible, wrong-headed policies pursued by Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki, that in effect alienated virtually all of the Sunnis in northern and western Iraq. So his policies, I think, gave the Sunnis in those areas the feeling that whatever was the alternative to the Iraqi army and Iraqi authorities was an acceptable alternative. It wasn't until ISIL actually occupied their territory they realized that was a terrible mistake. But the other part of this was Maliki appointing political hacks as general officers and senior officers in the Iraqi army, and the rank and file, many of whom are Shia, saw no reason to stand and fight in Mosul and other places for these political appointees as generals. Maliki basically fired all of the generals that had been trained and had been chosen on the basis of merit while the U.S. was still there. So a big part of the rise and success of ISIL was due to the mistakes of Prime Minister Maliki. The other piece of it, of course, is that it's a spillover from the civil war in Syria. ISIL would never have made an appearance had it not been for the ongoing civil war in Syria and the conflict among different opposition groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIL being among them.
But Dr. Gates, I want to ask you also about U.S. counterterrorism, our policy there, and I guess the question is, if that affected Al-Qaeda, has that led to the rise of groups like ISIL, in your opinion?
Well, no, I don't think it did. I think people can use that as a justification or as an explanation, but I think that the policies followed by both the Syrian and the Iraqi governments played a far more dramatic part in the creation of and success of ISIL than did U.S. or European counterterrorism measures.
Over the years, Dr. Gates, this past year in 2014, we've seen the rise of Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. They're trying to bring a new kind of radical Islamic state to those regions here. I mean, how successful do you think that they may be? And do you think there's been enough international effort to suppress the efforts by these two terrorist groups?
Ironically, Al-Shabaab has actually suffered some serious setbacks in Somalia, where they fundamentally controlled Mogadishu and significant parts of the country. And now they have turned to, if you will, exporting terror in Kenya and places like that. In Boko Haram, with respect to Boko Haram, I think it's as much a manifestation of the incompetence of the Nigerian army and the policies of the Nigerian government in their inability to counter Boko Haram as it is any appeal on the part of Boko Haram itself.
Of course, President Goodluck Jonathan has said that they would hopefully find and bring this to some kind of end, and that seems not to have happened yet. But also technology. The U.S. has sent technology into Nigeria, but yet and still they've been holding back on certain military equipment that the Nigerians say that they need to help combat Boko Haram. Do you think the U.S. perhaps could have done more or should be doing more to bring this to an end?
I don't know what specific equipment the Nigerian military has asked for. My guess is that the kind of support that actually would be helpful to them in terms of intelligence and that sort of thing, the U.S. probably would be prepared to help them. I think what I've seen over the years is a lot of these governments and a lot of their armies faced with an internal threat, if you will, want big ticket items, whether it's fighter aircraft or tanks or whatever, and it's totally inappropriate for the struggle against a group like Boko Haram.
Another question about these lone wolf attacks that we've seen, of course, in Canada and Australia. Is this a new phenomenon on your part, and what do you think could be done about that?
Well, I think we've seen these lone wolf attacks here in the United States. I think the first and most significant was probably the action by Major Nadal Hassan at Fort Hood when he killed 13 U.S. soldiers in 2009. We've seen the underwear bomber on the aircraft that was going in, I think, to Detroit. We've had the shoe bomber, the guy who tried to set an explosive that was in his shoes on another aircraft. So we've seen, and then we've seen the Boston Marathon bomber, and so on. So we are seeing these lone wolf attacks. They're basically people who have been self-radicalized through the internet, through whatever other means, and have taken action, have decided to take action on their own, very much influenced by the propaganda being put out by some of the extremist groups in the Middle East.
All right, Dr. Gates, thank you for being with us. And of course, we've got a lot more to talk about here. We'll pause for a break and be back with more from former Defense Secretary Robert Gates. You're watching a special edition of Arise Review. Stay with us. The killing and then the revenge killing of civilians sparked 50 days of war between Israelis and Hamas. Entire areas of Gaza were leveled as Israel hunted rocket launch sites and destroyed scores of tunnels. The death toll was incredibly lopsided. More than 2,000 Palestinians as compared to fewer than 70 Israelis. Yet both sides claim to be winners.
Israel has accepted the Egyptian ceasefire proposal. We hope that this time the ceasefire will stick.
In the attempt to prevent war, the international community has been trying to reach an agreement with Iran over its nuclear ambitions. It's been a year of drawn-out and frustrating negotiations to get the Shiite regime to curtail its enrichment program. The deadline for a deal has been extended to 2015. No doubt, the one most benefiting from the constant conflict in the Mideast and with Russia is Syria's President Assad. His use of chemical weapons against civilians raised international outcry and intervention in 2013. But this year, the brutal civil war and the hundreds of thousands displaced by it have been pushed into the background. Well, as Secretary of Defense, and before that with the CIA, our guest, Dr. Robert Gates, has been intensely involved with the ongoing tensions and conflicts in the Middle East. Dr. Gates, the question, does the most recent conflict in Israel provide an opportunity to make progress in peace negotiations, or is it just hardening attitudes on both sides, in your opinion?
I think one of the obvious characteristics of the Israeli conflicts with its neighbors has been that peace has been made only when there were strong and visionary governments, both in Israel and in the neighboring states. So in 1973, you had Anwar Sadat in Egypt, and you had Prime Minister Menachem Begin in Israel, and they were able to make peace, partly because they were both strong at home. I think part of the problem right now, particularly in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that in the case of the Palestinians, you have a relatively weak government on the West Bank, and what makes it worse is the Palestinians themselves are deeply divided between the West Bank Palestinians and Hamas. The West Bankers are prepared, I think, to make peace with Israel, and we've done a lot of training of their security people, and the Israelis have some respect for those security people. But Hamas has sworn to destroy Israel. So which Palestinians are the Israelis negotiating with? On the other hand, you have a very tough right-wing government in Israel led by Bibi Netanyahu. And I will tell you that the angriest I have seen multiple U.S. presidents with Israel has been over the settlements issue. And every time that the Israelis begin a new set of settlements, it sets the process back even further. So my own view is right now the conditions are not ripe for a successful negotiation to this conflict at this point, partly because of the policies of the Israeli government, partly because of the division within the Palestinians themselves, and the role of Hamas.
Right, you know, it certainly doesn't add to help that, of course, the recognition of Palestine as Palestinian as a state by Sweden and others is probably also will impact this peace process. But I want to move on to another process that seems endless at that point. Of course, that's Iran's nuclear program and trying to curtail it. In your opinion, do you think is Iran trying to buy more time here? Are they seriously engaged in trying to find a solution?
My personal view is that there probably is a division within Iran. There are some who really would like to have an agreement, but at the end of the day, it's the Ayatollah who makes the final decisions. And There actually was an agreement, not as far-reaching as many would have liked, but still there was an agreement several years ago in terms of getting rid of the already enriched nuclear material in Iran, and the Ayatollah vetoed it at the last minute. So I think the question is what Iran's intentions are, and I'm not sure they know at this point. Do they want to become a nuclear threshold state that would allow them to race to a nuclear weapon within 6 months to a year? Or are they potentially prepared to give up the idea of having nuclear weapons? And I think that's unresolved at this point. I think the big test in these negotiations is that the Iranians have about 18 or 19,000 of these nuclear centrifuges to produce enriched material. And we think that we in the West, the P5+1, basically have said you need to get down to somewhere around 4,000 or 5,000 centrifuges. The Ayatollahs said we're not only not going to destroy any centrifuges, we're going to build more. We're going to build many, many more than that. So the question is, can you limit these guys in their ability to race to a nuclear weapon that gives Western countries confidence that they could identify such a move and take steps to counter it before the Iranians actually had a weapon?
Dr. Gates, you mentioned something very important here, the Ayatollah, which a lot of people really have not focused on so much, but there's been another name in 2014 in the mix here, and of course you know who he is very well. His name is Hassan Rouhani. How much of a factor does he play in all these negotiations, and can we believe him in trying to turn the tide and us believing whether or not they don't have any nuclear ambitions in terms of weaponry?
Well, President Rouhani ran on a platform of trying to improve things economically for the Iranians. The Iranians find themselves in the same boat, if you will, that the Russians do, and that is that within the last year or so, the price of oil has plummeted, and so therefore has significantly worsened the impact of the already very tough sanctions in Iran, on Iran by the rest of the world. So they are facing some serious economic problems at home, and the question always has been, can we bring about the kind of diplomatic isolation and internal economic pressures in Iran that would lead the government of Iran to say, okay, looking at the cost-benefit analysis, let's walk away from this nuclear weapons thing. And if we can get a deal that allows us the peaceful use of nuclear energy for domestic purposes only, for civil purposes, let's cut that deal. I think that's what remains uncertain. And you have a lot of hardliners in the Revolutionary Guard and around the Ayatollah who don't want to cut that deal at all.
You know, indeed, that situation remains fluid at this point. We'll just have to wait and see exactly what happens there. But I want to move on to Syria. With everything else that's been going on in the world, of course, with terrorism, so on and so forth, there's a brutal civil war still going on in Syria, and a lot of people have seemed to have forgotten about that. I guess the question is, with no boots on the ground there, how can we change the situation in that particular country, in that civil war?
Well, I actually don't see much prospect for changing the situation anytime soon. I think there was a brief window of a few months at the very beginning of the civil war where the opponents of Assad actually had the upper hand, had momentum, and had we and others been able to provide a significant amount of support to the opposition, they may have been able to push Assad out of power, or at least push him out of power and make a deal with the Syrian military or others. That time is long past as far as I'm concerned, and one of the concerns that I had over the deal with respect to chemical weapons was that, first of all, it was a proposal by Vladimir Putin, which I think should have made us a little bit suspicious. There's no guarantee that they have not hidden away chemical weapons of some magnitude, and in fact, we've seen news reports that they've used chlorine and other kinds of chemicals against their people since that deal was made. But in effect, we got diverted by the 1,400 people who were killed in that terrible chemical weapons attack and lost sight of the 160,000 that have lost their lives or more, that have lost their lives through conventional weapons. And it's that large massacre of people, if you will, that I think we need to be focused on. But I think as long as Russia and Iran back Assad, as long as the opposition is divided in Syria, as long as the military and the Syrian military hold together, I see very little prospect of that situation getting any better anytime soon.
Right. We have a lot more to talk about with you, sir. Okay, when this special edition of Arise Review continues, there's yet another newer and more devious kind of aggression to consider. We'll discuss cyber attacks with Dr. Gates next. Stay with us.
The CIA would love it if you two could take him out.
The North Koreans didn't find the comedy's plot line funny. Angered, they launched a hack attack against Sony Pictures, along with threats against moviegoers. Kim Jong's government denies being behind the attack, but the FBI says it has proof that shows the trail leads right to the darkest corridors of North Korea's government. Of course, you're watching a clip from the movie, the interview released by Sony Pictures just now in independent theaters all throughout the country here. And of course, we're back with former Defense Secretary Robert Gates. Now, you started at the CIA, sir, in 1986, becoming director in 1991. When did cybersecurity become a major area of concern?
Well, first of all, cyber's been with us a long time. I would say that people need to understand cyber falls into essentially three buckets. There is the use of cyber, if you will, signals intelligence and other kind of intercepts by one government against another. And we have used this means of cyber, if you will, since before World War II. And it really became important during World War II. So that's one bucket. That's governments using cyber to spy on other governments for their own security purposes. The second bucket is more recent and really goes back probably about 25 years, and that is the use of cyber to gather economic intelligence, economic information that is advantageous to your own country's companies, or allows you to steal technology that you can then use either competitively, economically, or in terms of strengthening your own weapons systems. The third, and many countries have done this for a number of years. The third category is the one that has captured most people's attention more recently, and that is the use of cyber for denial of service, whether it's the internet or something else, or to destroy infrastructure or to destroy targets in an opposing country. And that's the bucket in which the apparent North Korean action falls. And that's fairly new, and that is the part that is, I think, for most governments, the most worrisome.
Absolutely, and I've talked to a lot of experts in the field of technology, and most say there's not much we can do against cyber attacks as well as hacking. We've talked about that, of course, with a whole lot of companies like Target and Home Depot and the like. I guess the question is here, with North Korea, if they are in fact behind this attack, and of course the government says, our government says that they are, the question is, what can we do about it? I mean, a country like North Korea, can they just hold another country hostage, or even another corporation, in a sense, like Sony, who didn't release the movie at first, and then, of course, under pressure, they decided to release it?
Well, I believe, first of all, that you can defend against this, and we have a number of protections in the .mil world, the military networks, particularly our secure networks, where we can protect them. And while I was secretary, we created, if you will, an umbrella of protection on a voluntary basis with certain U.S. defense industries that wanted to come under that umbrella to protect themselves against being hacked. The problem that we face when it comes to our critical infrastructure, whether it's the electrical grid or air traffic control or a variety of others, is that there is a wide range of disagreement between business and government, within the government, both within the executive branch and in the Congress, over what the proper role of the U.S. government is in protecting these networks. So we do have the capability through NSA to be able to protect a lot of this. The problem is NSA's authorities here at home are very limited, and there's just so much disagreement over what should be the proper role of government that very few steps have been taken. So there is some protection that is available. Our disagreements have prevented us from taking advantage of it, and until there is such an agreement, we are quite vulnerable. That is true.
I know. Well, you do mention some good news there, Dr. Gates, and I guess that we can all breathe a sigh of relief when it comes to cyber attacks here. But you've also advocated the cutting of spending on conventional weapons. That being the case, and with cyber attacks coming to the forefront here, where should the focus of funding be?
Well, first of all, I think the funding for cyber capabilities is it's just frankly not as costly as building supersonic aircraft or aircraft carriers and so on. And my understanding is that the funding for cyber activities and for defense in cyber has not been cut, that to the degree the Department of Defense has had any flexibility from the Congress, that funding has been pretty robust. We have created some new structures to be able to deal with this problem inside the U.S. government. When I was secretary, I created the Cyber Command that brings together all of the cyber capabilities of the American military, so it's under the command of one person, and we don't have a lot of dispersed authorities in that regard. So I think that we've structurally taken the necessary steps, and as far as I know, funding is being provided in a very robust way to this particular arena.
You know, Dr. Gates, I can't end this discussion with you about talking about politics in itself. Of course, with both the Bush and the Barack Obama administrations, you've worked for both, as we have mentioned here. You mentioned your battles, political battles on a daily basis with Congress, with the White House and, of course, the administrative staff there. And you also say that you've had some battles with both Bush as well as with Obama, but perhaps more with Obama. Explain.
Well, I think that certainly there was a big struggle within the Obama administration during 2009 in terms of what policies we should follow with respect to Afghanistan and in effect whether there should be a surge of forces from the U.S. and our allies in Afghanistan at the end of 2009. I think the president made the right decision in going forward with that, but it was about a 3-month debate. We did have a lot of issues in terms of, I had issues with what I called micromanagement out of the White House staff, not so much from the president, but people on the National Security Council staff, in essence trying to micromanage what the U.S. military was doing, and I resisted that. And then in the spring of 2011, I did have some disagreements. I was opposed to the intervention in Libya. I thought we had no idea what was going to happen when if Gaddafi was ousted. Frankly, I have the same concerns if we get rid of Assad. We don't have any idea what might follow him in Syria. So we don't fully understand unintended consequences, and we overestimate our ability to shape events in these places. So I had those disagreements in the spring of 2011. I also disagreed with how we responded to the so-called Arab Spring. I felt that we did not treat President Mubarak properly. We should have pressed for a more evolutionary change in Egypt. So there were some differences, yes.
You are an educator now. There are so many daunting issues to confront these days as we move from 2014 into 2015. What do you think young people should be focusing on as they go into government here? Should it be more political or should it be more issue-oriented?
I think it really depends on both the talents and the interests of the individuals involved. My worry is that young people will look at all the news about political paralysis in this country and political polarization, and they'll choose not to go into public service at all. So I think whatever venue young people want to pursue, if we can get them into public service, that's a good thing. Right now, there are only about 7%. It's only about 7% of the entire U.S. federal workforce that is under the age of 30. That's a third of what it was 25 or 30 years ago. So I worry that the ill odor, if you will, of politics in America today is driving talented young people away from public service. And I think the other thing we forget is that the federal government's not the only place where you can serve, where a young person can serve. There's local and state government. There are non-governmental organizations that do a lot of good work. I just think that the key is, as President George H.W. Bush put it, that public service need not be a career, but it should be a way of life. And so you don't even need to do it full time to be able to make a contribution.
Dr. Gates, I guess if there's a lack of bickering amongst the lawmakers in Congress, they'd set a better example. But moving forth here, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, Doctor. Any quick predictions for 2015?
No, I gave up trying to predict the future a long time ago when I was at CIA and realized we weren't very good at it.
Well, I got to tell you, this has been a wonderful hour, Dr. Gates. You've given us a lot of stuff to chew on for the future. We want to thank you, of course, for the service that you have provided to this country over many, many years here, and you are to be commended for that.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Okay. When we come back, our special edition of Review continues with a high-powered panel of guests. It promises to be a lively and informative discussion, so please stay with us.